Welcome to the Strategic Leader Podcast with me, Gemma Bullivant, and my co-host, Fiona Craig. This podcast is for HR professionals and people-focused leaders from any function who want to think, act, and feel naturally more strategic. Enjoy the show. Hi everyone, and welcome back. Good to have you with us. Thanks for joining. Hi Fee, how are you doing?
Hi there, Gem. I'm doing very well. How are you doing today?
Really good, thank you. Really good. I've had a good week, busy, as always.
As always, I'm glad to hear it. What are we talking about today?
We are following the theme from the last episode on imposter syndrome. We're going to be talking about the inner critic, taming our inner critic, and thinking about what that inner critic is there to do, how it might be helping us, but how it's more likely to be hindering us, and thinking about ways to actually ensure that it helps us more than it hinders us.
Yes, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I would say that most of us would acknowledge we have some degree of inner critic. It's an expression we use quite a lot. It's very linked with imposter syndrome. I think that there's a voice telling us that we've done something wrong or that we're not good enough.
Yes, I kind of picture it a little bit like a little devil on your shoulder, an animated version or something. That's kind of where mine sort of tends to go, which is, do you really want to do that? Is that really what you want to say? Is that the right thing to do here?
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you can sort of visualize a classic cartoon picture of the devil and the angel on your shoulders. I'd say mine's more of an AirPod, just the one. Bit lopsided. Mine doesn't sit on my shoulder. I think mine goes straight into my ear. But
Yeah,
they're definitely opinionated little buggers, aren't they? They've definitely
they
got a point of
certainly
view.
are.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes.
what are we looking at today then? What are we encouraging people to think about and get to in terms of their inner critic? Let's assume we all have one to a certain degree.
I think if we allow the inner critic to be the devil and that it doesn't necessarily provide us with helpful challenge and insight and advice, and we don't allow our inner voice to be a little more helpful and guiding in how it shows up, it has all of the hallmarks and all the tendencies to potentially hold us back from operating strategically, from minimizing our strategic impact, and not allowing us to do some of the things that we need to do in order to do our what we want to do and in the way that we want to do it or how we should be doing it. So I think there's a link, a very tangible link between what we choose to listen to and then how we behave as a result of listening to that voice.
Yes, that sounds really good in terms of our our constant quest to be a more strategic leader, which is the inner critic tends to show up in moments of stress, doesn't it? When something's gone a little bit wrong, or you may have let yourself down, or you may have done something that didn't land right. Maybe you've just fallen short of your expectations in some way. That's when the critic
Mm,
shows up. But in those moments, it may be more helpful to take a strategic view of what's actually happened and gone, well, hold on a second. What's actually happened here? Let's
mm,
zoom out and bring some perspective. And we often talk about
mm.
zooming out and achieving perspective from a strategic point of view, which is what's really happened here. How bad is it really? What can I learn from this experience? What needs to happen next? And that's a very kind of calm and balanced and strategic approach, which is not necessarily the work of that little devil on your shoulder or that AirPod in your ear. So we have to, it sounds like it's part of a strategic toolkit to be able to say, hold on, something appears to have gone wrong here. Let's get more perspectives than just that one that's instantly there. So yes, I think the word that comes to mind is discernment when we're listening to that voice, is to just bring an element of detachment to say, okay, I'm hearing that. Is that the most useful thing that I need to be hearing at the moment? And I mean, I think a really important word here is compassion, the sense that in two respects. One is the respect that this inner critic voice is anchored in something in our past that was probably quite needed. We probably needed some kind of watch out to keep us safe, psychologically safe in some environment we may well have been in the past. But that may no longer be relevant. We may no longer be in that situation. In the average day in the office, we're unlikely to be in that threatening situation, and therefore the voice may be less relevant. But we do need to show a little bit of compassion to say, okay, thank you very much for that voice. At some point in my history, you probably would have kept me safe. So we don't want to be rejecting that voice wholesale. We want to bring an element of discernment and to say, okay, I'll listen to what you have to say, but I'm not necessarily going to buy it wholesale. And then self-compassion, I guess, towards ourselves, which is, well, what might be a kinder way of looking at this situation or looking at this set of circumstances that's just happened? What
Mm.
might be a way that is more forgiving and that helps me move forward? Because we do need to learn from whatever it is that might have gone wrong, that might have triggered these feelings. So there's this sense of discernment about, I will listen to it, but I'm not necessarily going to buy it wholesale. And there may be other perspectives that I need to bring in here.
Yes, and I'm also thinking about the somewhat historic nature of some of the voice, which might be anchored in a past where we didn't have a certain set of skills or
Mm,
attributes
yeah,
to do
very
a
much so.
particular task, and that over time we've acquired the skills to be able to do something that previously we couldn't, but the voice hasn't quite caught up. The voice is still anchored back in at a time when we didn't have the right kind of wherewithal to do a particular task. So is that voice actually taking us back to a time that is no longer relevant to us because we can now do this type of activity? We are now in a position of a more senior role where we are expected to operate in a slightly different way to how we were expected to operate in the past, but the voice is still stuck in the past. It's still stuck in a sort of a blueprint of who we were then, as opposed to keeping up with how we're developing now.
Yes, absolutely. It's and that voice kind of lives in our ancient brain, the one that's very, very reactive, very fast, potentially quite crude. It doesn't give us many options.
Mm.
But that's kind of the hard wiring of our brain. And then we apply our executive function on top of that, which is, hold on a second, I'm not actually a threat here. I can bring some of my skills, as you say, some of my learnings, some of my judgment into play in the moments after. They're not quite as fast. They don't come through quite as fast. The voice comes through immediately. But we have got other things that we can apply and add to the mix if we so choose. So
Mm.
shall we have a look at some of the nuances of this critical voice and what we've said that we do need some kind of mechanism for, well, self-criticism or a kind of evaluation when perhaps we have fallen a bit short of our expectations. We do need some methodology for checking in and saying, hold on a second, that wasn't quite optimal, whatever just happened
Mm.
then.
Well, yes, and I think it comes back to the way in which we choose to interpret that information. So you used a great word earlier, which was discernment. And this is the almost taking a bit of a pause, hearing what's being said by that inner voice and saying, okay, that's interesting. I might approach that with curiosity rather than with defensiveness. I might approach that voice with a perspective that I need to actually consider it before I choose to believe it, or even before I choose to absorb it as an identifying label or attribute for myself. And instead, I just want to hear what it's got to say and think about whether I agree with it or not.
So should we think of an example then? I mean, the example that comes to my mind, I don't know what it says about me. The example that comes to mind of when something like this might show up is, for example, you're in a meeting with a bunch of senior people and you have just said something that doesn't land right.
Yeah.
Either you didn't explain yourself, or you've repeated yourself, or you've basically revealed that you weren't quite listening. And let's not forget, we've talked a lot about curiosity and the fact that it is okay to get stuff wrong and it's okay to ask questions. But sometimes, sometimes you may just genuinely get it wrong, and you'll say something and there's that tumbleweed moment, and a couple of people will look at you and you're kind of going, I can almost hear in my head someone's going, you total idiot, why did you bring that up? That's totally irrelevant to the conversation at hand. So and so doesn't like it. You were such an idiot. Why did you say that? Whatever that might have been. And then the critic is going, well, that's a really idiotic thing to have done. How senseless of you to say that. And it's sort of just giving you sort of negative vibes in your ear. We recognize the fact that voice may be uncontrollable, may sort of kick in. But then what else might we need to bring in that situation?
Well, one thing that I find really helpful, and I've got a bit of a coaching tool for this, which is a downloadable that you can access in the show notes, but I call it the inner team or the inner boardroom. I was introduced to this idea in my coaching training. It's not mine, but I don't know where the attribute for it sits. So what you're doing is you're not ignoring that voice. You're not trying to ignore the voice, because the voice will just keep kind of niggling away at you.
Mhm.
It won't go away if you choose to ignore it. It will keep re-emerging. So I find it more powerful to say, oh, thank you. Thanks for
Mhm.
your opinion. I am actually now going to listen to some other perspectives on this situation, and I'm going to invite those perspectives. So if I've visualized your voice, I can never get away from this animated devil, but there are
I can see it as we're sitting here recording. I can almost see it on your shoulder.
yes, I can't get away from this devil, but I have worked with coaching clients who have, I've asked them, so tell me what your critical voice looks like. Can you give it some sort of identity, some sort of image? Can you give it a name?
It's like a kind of
Mm,
nosy neighbor who's always judging everything that goes on in the street.
yeah.
But actually, in that character of the nosy neighbor, it could, they can be highly irritating and problematic, but they could also be a little bit irrelevant. It could
Yeah.
also be, well, what if we just chose to ignore the nosy neighbor?
And we could choose to ignore it, and that could work for us. But where it doesn't work, where it keeps cropping back up again, which is what I tend to find does happen, is that for a little while you can ignore it, but it kind of reemerges. And that's why I quite like this idea of in a boardroom, which is, let's pop a few different perspectives around a table. And let's remember that these are perspectives, they are opinions. And so, what we need to do is encourage these perspectives to also share some evidence, share something that is going to support what it is that they're saying. And if you can choose some people that are going to have some different perspectives to sit around the table, that then enables you to take a more balanced, a more qualified, a more measured approach to what it is that is being critiqued.
Who might these other characters be that's sitting around the table?
Well, there could be some supportive friends or supportive co-workers,
Hmm.
be people that you trust, that gives you some, honesty, but gives you it in more of a balanced way. We have, I think we can all think of a few critical friends
Hmm.
who we do trust will give us an honest perspective, but in a very compassionate way. Depends on the situation, of course, but if it relates to what happened in a particular meeting, for example, to use your earlier example, we could be looking at who else was in the room and what their perspective might be, especially if we think that they might have something that's a little different to your critical voice perspective. It's just an opportunity to go around the room and take a few perspectives. And I almost visualize myself plonking the devil down onto one of the chairs and saying, look, thank you, but I'm now going to listen to a few other views before I choose what I want to do with what you've got to say.
So in my case, I might have a supportive friend who's sitting there going, do you know what? It wasn't really that bad. Don't worry about it. It really wasn't that bad. I might have some kind of some kind of teacher, mentor type person going,
Mm.
okay, that was a bit suboptimal, but what have you learned from what just happened? And then I might go, oh, I might learn to, I don't know, think before I speak, perhaps, or I might learn to phrase the question more carefully before I say it, but still there's some value in me doing it. So I'm learning something. There might be some sort of challenger role going, what are you going how are you going to put this right? How, let's assume you can put this right. How are you going to go about doing that? So there's kind of different perspectives
Yeah.
coming in other than
There
just that
might be
one voice, which was, you're an idiot.
Yes, there might be somebody there that sort of says, "Well, usually you're very clear and articulate and eloquent, so I don't quite know what happened there. So, yeah, it was suboptimal, but it was a moment in time. It's not something that you do all of the time. I've seen you do this lots of times in a much better way." So there could be a different perspective that is
Yeah.
evidence-based as
Well, I
well.
like that evidence one. It's almost like somebody with a clipboard going, well, how many people actually really noticed that? The evidence suggests only one person noticed it. So actually, the conversation was derailed for, let's count them, 3 seconds. I think we can probably cope with that. And yeah, and bringing some hard evidence in is a really nice way of thinking about it.
So it's not only about balancing the view that is being put forward by your inner critic. It could be counterbalancing or counteracting some of it from an evidence perspective, but it's also adding a huge dollop of compassion
Mhm.
to the situation. And another approach that I quite like is to think about how you would approach this as the critical friend if it had happened or were happening to someone else, somebody that you care about. So a classic is if a friend came to you with this in this situation, what would you say to them? What would your guidance be to them? What would your advice be to them? Because that actually is another form of the inner critic. It's choosing it to be more of inner guidance than inner criticism.
So I really like this idea of inner guidance. There's this idea, isn't there, that as well as a critic, we also have a kind of sage figure, which could be a wise friend, a critical friend. It could be some kind of mentor. It could just be our own inner wisdom. Like, actually, we
Mm,
know it wasn't that bad. We just kind of have to allow ourselves to have that thought. It could be, I've come across a lovely model where I think they call it the inner mentor or something, but some of this kind of sage, wise, wisdomy perspective, which counterbalances this critic, is actually, this could be you in 20 years' time or even 5 years' time. What
mm,
would you say to yourself looking back? In 5 years' time, you're looking back on what just happened today. What would you say to yourself? The chances are it would be very kind, it would be compassionate, it would have a real sense of perspective, and it would help you move forwards. It wouldn't kind of stop you dead in your tracks. There'd be some kind of learning in there as well.
mm,
So this wiser voice could come externally in the form of a critical friend, or it could just be a different version of you. But either way, we're kind of looking for sources of wisdom that can counterbalance that critical voice.
absolutely. And often what happens when you think about the inner critic, it is critical, it is judgmental, it is focusing on the problems or the mistakes. But the inner guidance is also focusing more on solutions. It's focusing more on what we might want to do differently. It's focusing more on the fact that perhaps we are doing more than we did in the past, that we've developed, that we've grown, that we have these skills that we didn't used to have. And it is coming from a place of care and empathy. It's coming from a place of wanting you to be a better version of yourself than you currently are. Where the inner critic, for me, is trying to reduce you, the inner guide is trying to improve you.
Oh, that's lovely, isn't it? Because the inner guide is pointing you towards the future to say, well,
Mm,
this is what perhaps needs to be tweaked in order to move forwards and grow and get better. But it could be starting from a point of, actually, you are great, but you can still be even better. Whereas a critic is like, that was bad. You kind of need to stop where you are, or be less than somehow. It's quite reductive, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I've got my critical devil on one shoulder, but I've now also got a kind guide, kind but challenging,
Yeah.
but in a compassionate way, on the other shoulder. So at least I have got some balance to some of those voices that we inevitably hear. Now, you mentioned this approach, this way to kind of tackle this in the moment. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is from a book called Saboteurs. And it is a methodology that is and there's lots to it, but at its core, it's really simple. It involves noticing, firstly, so 3 steps. Firstly, notice when your inner critic, in this book, they call it the judge, as one of many saboteurs we have, but the big one is the judge. And that's like your devil on your shoulder. So the first step is simply notice when the judge is at work and go, that's my judge talking. So that's all you need to do, is notice it. Often we don't notice that judge has been at work until after the event. But that's okay. It's just the act and the practice and the discipline of noticing, that's my inner critic voice. That's just a voice. The second thing is to recognize that we have a choice here. That actually it's just one perspective. That's just one voice. There are others. And often things like just physiological things like taking a deep breath. If you can do this in the moment, you can take a deep breath and reset. You can kind of bring your shoulders down. You can bring some relaxation into the body, some space into the brain, and go, let's just have a little kind of neutral, like shifting into neutral. That's step 2. And then the third thing is, okay, what does my inner sage, that's where this language of the sage comes from. What does my inner sage have to say about this? I'd like to hear that perspective. And then tapping into that sage. What do I need to get curious about? What do I need to learn? What do I need to be compassionate about? So those 3 steps. The first thing is noticing that it's the judge at work. Oh, there's the judge. The second step is just shifting into neutral. Take a deep breath. And they use this expression called self-command, which is just, in a way, forcing your brain. And initially, it does require a bit of force to go, I'm going to physically, or I guess mentally, shift my brain from that way of thinking to a different way of thinking. What if it were not the only perspective? And that can sometimes be a real mental effort to shift. And then the third thing is, okay, what would my sage, now that I've managed to shift my perspective, what would my sage have to say here? And then that just allows, it just kind of opens the possibility that there are other voices. I guess that's where you might have your inner board of directors, which is, what are the other perspectives that I could bring to bear here? But just those 3 steps is, I find, quite a helpful little model with that neutral one in
Yeah,
the middle.
I love that. Really like the neutral step. And I think that can apply to so many situations, can't it? Because that is where you shift from acting on autopilot, behaving on autopilot, to behaving intentionally. And in order to behave intentionally, we do need to engage that shift into neutral first. That's that pause, that take a beat. I've just been watching Blue Lights, so everything's about taking a beat at the
Taking a
moment, don't they?
beat.
Take a beat, take a breath, just think about what's happening just for a moment. And I think we've talked about this before. If we haven't, we'll talk about it again. The difference between react and respond.
Yes.
React is instantaneous. Respond has had that little breath in the middle to enable us to respond in the way that we want to respond in that moment.
And that is a really strategic skill, isn't it? To be able to just separate my response. How am I going to show up? What am I going to say next? What needs to happen next from, okay, what's just happened? And
Mm,
as a leadership skill, I think that's absolutely phenomenal, because we've all been in situations where somebody has just flown off the handle, or someone's thrown a strop, or someone's just mentally shut down and removed themselves from the conversation because it's too triggering, it's too difficult. And it's ever so childish. It's the child taking over. It's the devil. It's the saboteur taking over. And to be able to go, hold on a second, this is, I definitely don't want this. I definitely don't like this. But I'm just going to pause and say, okay, how would a professional behave in this moment? And that's how I'm going to behave, is a really, really strong leadership skill to gain.
Fantastic. Based on this conversation, I'm going to make sure that when that little devil shows up on my shoulder, I'm going to take a breath and make sure that I've also got the sage on the other shoulder.
Well, Jem, what's very funny about that, and obviously we can't see you, but listeners will find this amusing, is that I'm looking at Jem, and literally on the other shoulder, behind her, she has got a little Buddha sitting on a shelf. So I can literally see your wisdom sitting on your shoulder.
There it is.
There it is. So your
Buddha.
devil actually doesn't exist. You have a Buddha sitting on your opposite shoulder. So, you can think of that.
There we are. And maybe that visual will help me connect with that idea. Who knows? Hopefully some of this has maybe sparked some thinking in terms of how your inner critic shows up. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What's its impact on you? And what might you choose to do differently and take a different perspective, a different approach to enable you to be a little more impactful, a little more strategic, a little more of the type of leader that you want to be.
Wonderful. We would like to thank you all so much for listening to us today. And we'd love to hear your feedback on this episode or indeed any of the other episodes. So do get in touch with us via LinkedIn. And also you can share your thoughts on any questions that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes. We'd be really interested to hear that. Much of the content we come out with is based on what we hear from our coachees, but it would also be great to have some questions and feedback from you. So do get in touch. We would love to hear from you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the fabulous conversation, Fee.
Thank you very much, Jem. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to access more of our recordings. And if you think it'd be useful for someone else, please forward to them and leave a review. We base our content on questions we are regularly asked and what you want to know more about, so please do email us with any questions or comments to gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk. And remember, you're already being more strategic than you realise.